Hi guys! Today we're going to learn about the distributive property. In our first video, I'll explain what the distributive property is. We'll go over an example, and I'll show you when you should use the distributive property and when you shouldn't. Don't forget to take notes. So the distributive property looks like this. In the original problem, you have parentheses surrounding either an adding problem or a subtracting problem. And then right in front of the parentheses, or sometimes right behind the parentheses, you have another number or letter. This number or letter needs to be attached and right next to the parentheses. When you're doing the distributive property, what you're going to do is you're going to take the number that is immediately outside of the parentheses, and you're going to multiply it by each term on the inside of the parentheses. Now, terms are numbers and variables that are being multiplied together, and they're separated by adding and subtracting signs. So in this scenario, I have two terms on the inside. So I'm going to take my A and I'm going to distribute it. I'm going to multiply it by the B, and I'm going to multiply it by the C. And that gives me my new answer over here. The distributive property should only be used when there are variables in the problem. So if a problem is only numbers, we're not going to use the distributive property. There has to be some sort of letter in the question. All right, let's try an example. Here is an example where we would use the distributive property. I know I'm going to use the distributive property because I see some parentheses. I see a number attached immediately outside of parentheses, and I see variables in the problem. That's how I know when to distribute. In this question, I'm going to distribute my 4 to each term on the inside. Now again, terms are separated by adding and subtracting signs, so we want to be very careful. In this problem, there are 1, 2, 3 terms. The 3y are held together by multiplication, so they are considered to be one term. You don't want to separate them. We only separate with where the adding and subtracting signs are. So I'm going to take my 4 and I'm going to multiply it by my x. Then I'm going to take my 4 and I'm going to multiply it by the 3y. Then I'm going to take my 4 and multiply it by the z. Again, notice that the 4 is being multiplied by the 3y. It's not being multiplied by the 3 and then also by the y. Okay, so be careful with that. If you just have a number and a letter to multiply them together, just write them right next to each other. For the middle term, we did have another number. We had the number 3, so you are going to multiply the 4 times the 3, and that'll turn into a 12. And that's how you do the distributive property. All right, let's take a moment to check and see when we should distribute. How do we know by looking at a problem that it's a distributing problem and not something else? Here is an example of when we should distribute. In this problem, we know we should distribute because we see some parentheses, and right next to the parentheses on the outside, there's a number. That's what we'll be distributing. And then also on the inside of the parentheses, there's an adding or subtracting problem. This is definitely a distributing problem. Here's an example of when we shouldn't distribute. This problem is very similar to the first one, but the 2 is not right next to the parentheses. It's separated by an adding sign. Since the 2 is not right next to the parentheses, we would not distribute on this problem. Here's another example where we would distribute. Even though the 2 is not right in front of the parentheses, it is right next to the parentheses. It's just written on the other side. Since it's right next to the parentheses, we would distribute that 2. Here's an example of where we would not distribute. Just like that first problem, the 2 is separated from the parentheses by an adding sign, so we would not distribute on this problem. Here's an example where we would distribute. In this scenario, we would distribute the 4 because the 4 is right next to the parentheses. We would not distribute the 3 because it's separated, it's too far away. Here is an example of when we would not distribute. Even though we have a number right next to the parentheses, this problem does not have any variables. When a problem does not have any variables, instead of distributing, you would do the order of operations, or PEMDAS. Here is an example where we would distribute. We're actually going to watch how to distribute this on the next video. In this scenario, because it's a minus sign in front of the parentheses, that's why we would distribute. When it's a plus sign, we don't, but when it's a minus sign, we do. And finally, here's another example of where we don't distribute. In this first example, the minus sign was in front of the parentheses, so it was attached to the parentheses. In this second example, the minus sign is in front of the 7, and so it's attached to the 7. It's not attached to the parentheses. This concludes video 1.